Hello again. I'm here. I'm ready for grant events. So make sure you have your history book out and you've got it turned to the place where we can continue our notes for grant. Um, Here we are. We're ready for This is Grant. Okay. And before we start, I want to do a little bit of a review and see if you remember some of these guys. I have some more flashcards of the presidents, and I'm mixing them up. I'm going to start with an easy one, and you just call out and keep track of how many you get right. Okay, here we go. Ready? Good. You should have known that was Lincoln. Here we go. Who do you think this is? Jackson. I'm going to do them one at a time so I can see the back. Pierce. One of my favorites, John Adams. We should all know this. Washington. What about this guy? We just talked about him. Who was the one before Grant? This is Johnson. Okay. Before Lincoln. That's Buchanan. Who's that? Van Buren. Monroe. My favorite, John Quincy Adams. Pretty popular one. Jefferson. Fillmore. Taylor. Similar name, Tyler. Madison. Polk. And last one, he wasn't around very long, William Henry Harrison. All right, good review. Okay, now back to this guy. Okay, Grant. Now, we talked about his personal yesterday, and we see that he is a military guy, but he has kind of an easygoing demeanor. He's not super ambitious. He doesn't seem to be. Really seems like he would be the nice guy, the guy that lots of people liked. All right, so we're dealing with the time period about the end of the 1860s, 1869 to right before 1880. 1880, by the time 1880 comes, things are booming in America. So this 69 to 77 period is important too because lots of things are happening. So I'm going to have quite a bit here. I want you to pause if you need to, make sure you get it down, but all this is important, and then we can just keep rolling. This will finish out Grant today, and then we can move on to Hayes. Okay, so this time period that we're dealing with here, one name for it that was given was the Gilded Age. And that name was given by Mark Twain, who was a writer. He wrote Tom Sawyer, he wrote Huckleberry Finn, and but he wrote too a lot about society and government and what his opinions about them. Do you know what the word gilded means? If something is gilded, does it sound like something to you? Gilded means golden or coated in gold. So it was a fascinating time because it was a time of corruption. There was a lot of people using people and doing things for their own interest, greed. They were just greedy. But then because of it, because they were corrupt and greedy, then many became rich. And it was a time of splendor. Really fancy hotels were built, really nice. And they started building houses, and their houses were just extravagant. Maybe there's something like them around today, but it just seemed to be, the word is opulence. Opulence is just way bigger than it needs to be. Just fancy rich. And you have a lot of owners of companies own their They're inventing things. They're coming up with things. They're starting these companies and they're taking advantage of poor workers, immigrants who need a job and they just know how to put this here and put this here. And that's all they do is they stand there and they do their job and they don't pay them very much. But yet the owner of the company is making bukus of money. Okay, but they're not paying their workers very much. So see how it was corruption, but at the same time wealth. So you have this big difference between the very, very wealthy and the very, very poor. There's not a lot of middle ground. The next thing here I want to show you, this is me on vacation. A few years ago, we went up and we did a big tour. We went up the New England, and I planned it according to the president's houses that we would get to see. This is not a president's house, but this was very close to FDR's house. And this is Vanderbilt's house. And Vanderbilt this was built around this time. And Vanderbilt was one of these people who had become rich off of these different industries, off of the shipping industry, and then his son off of the railroad. And what you don't see, this is over here is where we came up, and it's kind of the driveway. But this side is the main part of the house because it faces this big river here. And all the traffic was going up and down the river, and all the fancy rich people built their houses on the river, and you could see them. When we were standing here, we could look across the river and see the other big fancy houses over there looking back at this one. So it was like they were waving at each other going, hey, look at me. I have a lot of money too. I can build a big fancy house. Okay, so this was a time of extreme, extreme wealth, but not for everybody and not for most. Okay, for the very few. So here's our notes about that. We have very fancy homes built. So this is a little bit more about the Gilded Age. Hotels for the extremely rich while others lived in extreme poverty. So that's how we're going to word what I just was trying to tell you. Here's a few of the people that we're talking about. Big names that, like I've said, just things that you should, cultural literacy, things that you should know. Here's one name, Cornelius Vanderbilt. Okay, so shipping and railroads. John D. Rockefeller started the Standard Oil Company, and Andrew Carnegie opened the first steel plant, which is not too far from where we live in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And he also, as he became very wealthy, well, he didn't pay his workers very much, but he also wanted to use his wealth well in some ways, and one way that he began doing that was building public libraries, and this idea of people being able to come and take out books for free was new, and that was Andrew Carnegie built the first public library. Okay, so again, if you need to pause, I'm just going to keep rolling. Okay. Another thing that we need to know simultaneously is happening. So it is the Gilded Age, but also Reconstruction continues. Remember, Reconstruction started with Andrew Johnson. Reconstruction, you're building back. What are we building back? The country, right after the Civil War. So this is also a time when I say Reconstruction, I mean that there are federal troops stationed in the South to make sure that they did their part to come back to the Union. They had promised to do certain things. Now, we've already talked about some of these things they were not doing, were they? They had made their own laws called Black Codes that were intentionally trying to keep African Americans from having no right to vote and from having very little right in society. And so Reconstruction is continuing, but the South is still trying to not let the African Americans have their rights. So Grant wanted to bring the South back into the Union, but he also wanted to make sure they were doing what they needed to do for the rights of everyone. And he passed, with the help of Congress, he passed two laws, the Force Act of 1870 and the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871, and they were both passed to try to force the South to stop terrorizing the blacks. So you stop doing this, or we're going to come down there and make you do it. And these acts did, I'm going to scoot up just a little bit, temporarily help. Temporarily means not for good, right? For a while they helped, and they gave African Americans safety, but it only lasted while there was troops in the South. And we're going to see pretty soon that they're going to be pulled out. And as soon as troops are pulled out and there's no one saying you have to do this, then they go right back to what they were doing before. Also, I think this is really cool. It was just recently that I learned this, and I had no idea that in 1875 there was a Civil Rights Act passed. Civil rights. When I think of Civil Rights Act, I think 1960s. But the first Civil Rights Act was passed in 1875, and Congress passed it to integrate hotels, theaters, and restaurants, meaning you cannot say whites only. You have to let all people eat at your restaurant. You have to let people in the theater. You have to let people in their hotel. What's the problem? We know that that's what the law did in 1960, so why did this one not work? Okay, here's the deal. One, it wasn't enforced well. And then two, just a few years later, this is a really sad part, I think. It was declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. How? In 1883, to say, oh, we gave you your rights, but that's not actually constitutional. We didn't really mean to do that, so we take it back. I don't know. And it says there, and then I put, there is not another Civil Rights Act passed until 1960s. So we passed one, but then we took it back. Kind of crazy. And now I have the meanwhile, so that's kind of the things going on governmental wise. So I told you about what society's looking like, the big guys rising up, and then what it looks like in the South and how that's trying to come back together. But there's a few other things going on constantly. Remember, history is just like an overlay. There's so many things going on at the same time. So meanwhile, don't forget, now this is back where I'm going backwards a little bit, but I want to make sure we remember, we didn't really talk about this much, and I wish we had talked about it more. May 10th, 1861, the Transcontinental Railroad was completed when the tracks met in Promontory Point, Utah, and connected with the Golden Spike. So they drove the Golden Spike in where those two companies met, and now we've had for several years now, so this is 1861 and we're talking about the 1869, so we have a railroad that goes all the way across the country now. That's a big deal. So I have here, this is continuing to bring big changes to the country. I want you to just think about that. I want you to think about how the railroad would change the country. Being able to go from one part of the country all the way to the other, so much easier than getting in a covered wagon, okay, which wasn't too much earlier than this, okay. 1868 to 1869, we have the bicycle, the two-wheeled bicycle becoming popular. People are riding the bicycle around, especially more so in cities. You wouldn't see it as much in the West, but in the cities, people are starting to bicycle from place to place. Bicycling groups are starting to be organized, and it became a thing. 1869, here's another thing. The first baseball team, I should have held out on the name for you, Cincinnati Red Stockings. Not the Red Sox, the Stockings, in 1869. And then in 1871, a horrific event happened in Chicago that completely changed. Chicago already at this point was a city. It was a big city. Okay, now we don't have cars and things like that, but we talked about the other day about what a city would look like, that you would have horse carts, that you would have just filth and lots of buildings just going up really high and just just little bitty apartments for people to live in. And so Chicago was full of people. And there was a fire that spread. Again, I've got my trusty book here beside me. I want to make sure I get the right information for you. It spread over 4 square miles of the city, including all the downtown business districts, so all those big businesses that were there. And it blazed for 3 days until they could get it under control. 90,000 people became homeless. 90,000. That's hard to even imagine. And then this is the legend, and no one really knows how it started, but a lot of people believe that it was started by Mrs. O'Leary's cow that knocked over a lantern in her barn, and then it just spread and spread and spread and spread and spread and spread and spread. Can you think about that? That's what all of history is, right? That's anything. Starts small and can become something so big. Kind of makes you stop for a minute, doesn't it? And think. It also connects to Hatchet. Remember, he's building a fire, and think about just how small it started, but how he could get it going and how he had to keep it going. And it became so important. So it can become important, it can become life-giving, but it can also be destroying. That'll preach too. There's a lot of things like that too, aren't there? Okay. Now, 1872, we have a couple of other kind of quick things going on. Okay, so Susan B. Anthony. Susan B. Anthony was a woman who was a leader in trying to get rights for women. So she was really in favor of women having the right to vote. And she actually showed up at the 1872 election and voted, or tried to vote. She was arrested and fined, which she refused to pay. They eventually let it go. They dropped the case, because had they not dropped the case, she would have taken it all the way to the Supreme Court, and women might have had the right to vote before 1911 if they had done that. But they dropped it so that she would not be able to go to a higher court and get things changed. Another thing in 1872. Okay, so go back to the train. Now look at this one. Mail order catalogs began. Now that you have a train, now that I have a way. So think about all those people that went out and they're in the West and they're completely cut off from anyone in the East. Now, this person that lives out in the middle of nowhere can get a sewing machine. Think about that. Can order a dress. Doesn't have to make everything completely from scratch. So there were a couple people who saw, we can make some money off of this. Now we've got a train moving. We've got supplies moving back and forth. Think about what the train brought in. Think about all of the wealth that it brought to the North. The North and all those factories could make supplies and send them out west. Think about the things that the people out west could. What resources did they have that they could be sending back east that maybe the East needed? Think about that. This idea of the train, it's a big deal. A big deal. So mail order catalogs began. Montgomery Ward was the first one, and then Sears, who you should know that name. Sears came along a little bit later after that. Then in 1876, we have a man named Alexander Graham Bell with the telephone. Received the patent for the telephone in 1876. Now, a lot of people thought that they thought it was kind of kooky. They didn't think that it was going to it was going to be a big deal, but we know that it did. We depend on them now, don't we? And it goes back to 1876, well before that, because this is when he had the patent, so obviously he was working on it before then. And then another 1876, General Custer, and this is called Custer's Last Stand. General Custer was a soldier from the Civil War. He was actually the youngest. When he was 23, he became the youngest general in the Union Army during the Civil War. So, like a lot of um, army people during the Civil War, after the Civil War, they became um, they went to fighting Indians in the West. Because here's another effect of the train. As the train comes out west, what do they run into? Native Americans, right? And the Native Americans had that land and roamed that land, and now there's this big steel horse, this big steel machine coming through their land, cutting through their land. And the United States wants access to that because as the train comes through, what's going to happen on the sides of the train? Cities, towns, more and more people are moving out. They want the Indians to be pushed farther and farther and farther and farther out. Don't bother us. Get where you get away from us. And so they had a lot of these older military generals go out, and they were fighting the Indians and kind of relocating them is kind of the nice word. And so he was told to take his unit and kind of scout out where some bands of Sioux and Cheyenne had left their reservation. So they had been told, hey, we won't bother you if you go to this reservation. You stay here, and this is where you live now. Well, there were a lot of them that thought, who are you to tell us what to do? And they left, and they were planning on fighting. They were going to fight the white people. And so he was told to go and find these groups that had left and were considered hostile. But instead of just kind of scouting out, he disobeyed orders and attacked the village, which had all kind of people and children and everything. He attacked the village, and this village had thousands of Indians, including some powerful war chiefs, like you've probably heard names like Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. And when they attacked, he was killed, and this was called the Battle at Little Bighorn, and he was attacked and killed during this battle. And this is another one of those things that Little Bighorn, you should know that name. You should know General Custer. I'm trying to pick big things that you should know. Okay. In the comment section on this video, I want you to pick one thing I talked about. It could be the train, which there's a lot of things that I can think of with the train, or it can be any of these other things. It could be the catalogs. It could be the telephone. It could be the bicycle even. Any of these. The biggest one might be the train, but pick one of these things and go in the comment section, and I want you to write an idea about how that one thing changed the United States, changed history. What is one effect? Give me one effect of one of the things that I talked about today. Okay, and write that in a comment. Read the other comments that have been posted. Try not to post the exact same idea. You can post about the same thing. If someone writes about the train, you can write about the train, but try to think of either something to add to what they said or a different effect that you can think of. Because I know you all, you have tons of questions. You have tons of good thoughts, and your minds are just rolling now, and I know it. And I want to hear what you are thinking. Okay? Hope you have a great rest of your day.